What would you do if at 19 years old you owned nothing in the world but the clothes on your back and $10 folded into your shoe? That was the entirety of Marguerite Voss's fortune on the December morning she stood outside the boarding house in Cardwell Harbor, Maine, and watched the landlady, Mrs. Puckett, set her carpetbag on the frozen step and lock the door behind her. Because the last of the money Marguerite's late father had left her was gone, and a girl without family or income was, in the eyes of most respectable establishments, no better than a vagrant. The man responsible for her ruin was Josiah Kettering, a shipping investor who had once been her father's partner and had, in the space of a single terrible year, maneuvered himself into ownership of everything her father built. With her $10, Marguerite did not buy a train ticket south or a week's lodging. She walked instead to the harbor auction and bought, for that same $10, the abandoned Navy Yard at the north end of the point. A condemned tangle of rotted pilings and collapsed sheds that the town had written off as a ruin 20 years before. They called her a fool, a girl playing at inheritance with a dead man's money. But beneath the old dock, sealed away where no auctioneer had thought to look, was something that would shock the whole of Cardwell Harbor and change the course of Marguerite Voss's life forever. Settle in and let us tell you her story. If you have ever stood on a piece of forgotten ground and felt, without knowing why, that it still had something left to give, tell us about it in the comments. And if these stories of overlooked places and quiet justice speak to you, we would be glad to have you follow or subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the next one. Marguerite Voss was born in the spring of 1882 in a narrow clapboard house within sight of the Cardwell Harbor waterfront. The only child of Henrik Voss, a Norwegian-born shipwright who had come to Maine as a boy and risen, through decades of careful, patient labor, to co-own one of the finest small shipbuilding yards on the coast. Her mother had died of a fever when Marguerite was 6, and so it was her father who raised her, and who did so in a manner unusual for the time, believing that a daughter with a curious mind and steady hands deserved as thorough an education in his trade as any son might have received. From the time she was old enough to walk the yard without falling into the water, Marguerite trailed after her father among the half-built hulls and coils of tarred rope, learning the names of every timber, the keel, the ribs, the strakes, the knees that braced a ship's frame together, and learning, too, the deeper lesson her father wove through all of it, that a vessel's strength was never in its polish, but in what lay hidden beneath the waterline, in joints and fastenings no passenger would ever see, but on which every life aboard depended. Henrik Voss was a man of few words but exacting standards, and he taught his daughter to read wood the way a physician reads a pulse, to run her palm along a plank and know by feel alone whether it had been cured properly or rushed to market green and weak. He also taught her the yard's own history, for the Voss and Kettering shipyard, as it was then called, had been built in partnership with a younger, more ambitious man named Josiah Kettering, a merchant's son with capital but no craft, who had supplied the money that let Henrik expand his modest boat works into a proper yard capable of building coastal schooners. For years the partnership worked well enough, Henrik supplying the skill and integrity, Kettering supplying connections and investment, and Marguerite grew up believing the two men to be, if not quite friends, then at least honest partners bound by mutual respect. It was only much later that she came to understand how one-sided that respect had always been, and how patiently a man like Kettering could wait for an opportunity to claim the whole of something he had only ever half-owned. Her father, meanwhile, had also served for some years in his youth at the old Cardwell Navy Yard itself, a small federal shipbuilding and repair station established during the years after the war between the states to service naval vessels along the northern coast. decommissioned and shuttered in the early 1880s when newer, larger yards at Portsmouth and Boston rendered it obsolete. Henrik rarely spoke of his years there, beyond mentioning once or twice, almost in passing, that the Navy had left the place in a hurry, and that a man who knew where to look might still find traces of what they'd abandoned, though he never explained what he meant by that, and Marguerite, absorbed in the ordinary business of growing up, never thought to press him for more. What she carried forward from her childhood, more than any specific memory, was her father's unshakable conviction that value was rarely obvious at first glance, that the soundest ship and the weakest one might look identical from the dock, and that patience, careful observation, and honest labor were the only reliable ways of telling the difference between the two. A philosophy that would, though she could not have known it then, become the single thread holding together everything that was to come. The slow unraveling of Marguerite's world began in the autumn of 1899, when a series of poor harvests and a downturn in coastal shipping credit put pressure on shipyards up and down the Maine coast, Voss and Kettering included. Henrik, now approaching 60 and slowed by a chest ailment that worsened with each damp winter, found himself increasingly dependent on Kettering to manage the yard's finances, a dependency Kettering encouraged with great shows of concern and generosity, extending personal loans to cover payroll during lean months, always with proper paperwork, always with reassurances that the debt was a mere formality between old partners and nothing Henrik need worry over. Marguerite, then 17 and increasingly involved in the yard's daily operations since her father's health made long days on the water difficult for him, noticed things her father, trusting and unwell, did not. That Kettering's loans carried interest rates far steeper than any bank in Portland would have offered. That the paperwork Kettering brought for signature grew longer and more complicated with each visit, and that Kettering himself, once content to remain a silent investor, had begun spending long hours in the yard's office, familiarizing himself with every ledger and contract as though preparing for something. She raised her concerns to her father once, gently, and he waved them away with the same tired confidence he had shown his whole life, insisting that Josiah Kettering, whatever his faults, was not a man who would ruin a partner of 20 years over money. Henrik Voss died in February of 1900, his weakened lungs finally overcome by a hard winter's cold, and it was only in the weeks following his funeral, as Marguerite began sorting through the yard's affairs, that she discovered exactly how thoroughly her father's trust had been misplaced. The loans Kettering had extended over the previous year, it turned out, had been secured not merely against the yard's equipment and inventory, as Henrik believed, but against his entire ownership share, structured through language dense enough that even the family's longtime lawyer admitted he had not caught its full implication until it was far too late to challenge. Within 3 months of her father's death, Kettering had called every note due simultaneously, and Marguerite, 18 years old, grieving, and without the legal standing or resources to fight a man of Kettering's wealth and connections in court, watched the entirety of her father's life's work pass into Josiah Kettering's sole possession for a fraction of its true worth. He renamed it, within the year, simply Kettering Shipbuilding, and he did not offer Marguerite so much as a clerking position in the office her own father had built. She spent the following months taking in mending and working occasional shifts at the fish cannery to survive, watching what little savings her father had left dwindle steadily away. Until, on that December morning outside Mrs. Puckett's boarding house, she found herself with nothing left at all but $10 and a decision to make. Marguerite had walked past the old Navy Yard countless times in her life, without giving it much thought. A stretch of condemned waterfront at the north end of the harbor that the town had simply let go to ruin after the federal government abandoned it. Its warehouses collapsed, its dry dock silted in, its long dock reaching out into the harbor on pilings, so rotted that local children were forbidden from playing near it for fear the whole structure might give way beneath them. It had sat unclaimed and untaxed for nearly 2 decades, a piece of history nobody wanted, until the town council, eager to clear the liability from its books, put it up for a nominal sale that December, expecting perhaps some scrap dealer or ambitious fool to take it off their hands. When Marguerite heard the notice read outside the courthouse, something in her father's old teaching stirred, that instinct to look past the ruin at the surface and ask what might still be sound beneath it. And she found herself, almost before she had consciously decided anything, offering her entire $10 for a piece of condemned federal land that every other bidder in town considered worthless. The clerk handling the sale barely suppressed his amusement as he took her money, remarking that she'd bought herself a fine collection of rotten wood and mudflats, and several onlookers laughed outright, the story spreading through Cardwell Harbor by suppertime as further evidence that the Voss girl, having lost her father's yard to sensible business dealings, was now squandering what little remained of her dignity on a worthless ruin out of pure sentiment. Marguerite did not much care what they said. She had nowhere else to sleep and no better prospect in front of her, and so that first night she made her way out to the old yard with a borrowed lantern and a blanket, picking her way carefully through collapsed timber to the one structure still mostly standing, a small stone harbormaster's cottage near the head of the dock, and there she settled in, cold and uncertain but, for the first time in months, sitting on ground that was entirely her own. It was in the days that followed, as she began the slow work of clearing debris from the cottage to make it livable, that she found, tucked into a gap behind a warped floorboard, a small oilskin packet that had clearly been hidden there deliberately, rather than lost by accident. Inside, wrapped against the damp, she found a single folded page in handwriting she recognized instantly, and with a jolt that stopped her breath entirely. Her own father's hand, dated some 18 years earlier, from the last months before the Navy Yard's closure, when Henrik Voss had still worked there as a young shipwright. The note was brief and strange, referencing something he called the Talbot iron, and instructing whoever found it to look beneath the dock itself, at the third piling from the seaward end, below the waterline at low tide. Marguerite sat with that page for a long while in the cold cottage, her father's familiar handwriting suddenly carrying the weight of a message reaching across nearly 2 decades, and she understood, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that this ruin she had bought for $10, in an act of near desperate stubbornness, held something her father had wanted found, and had perhaps always intended, in some quiet corner of his heart, that she would be the one to find it. It took Marguerite the better part of a week to work up the courage and the means to investigate her father's message, for the tide had to be low enough and the weather calm enough to make wading beneath the old dock anything but a foolish risk, and she had no one to help her and no one she trusted enough to ask. When the morning finally came, cold and still with a hard frost silvering the mudflats, she waded out in her father's old canvas coat and a pair of borrowed boots, counting pilings from the seaward end until she reached the third, and there, just as the note described, she found what appeared at first to be nothing more than an unusual thickness in the timber, a section of the piling reinforced with iron bands that didn't match the construction of any other post along the dock. Working with a small hatchet and her bare, freezing hands, she discovered that the piling was not solid at all below a certain point, but hollow, fitted with a cleverly disguised iron door no more than 2 feet square, its hinges packed with tar that had, remarkably, kept the mechanism from seizing entirely. Behind that door, in a chamber built into the piling itself, and sealed above the ordinary high water line, she found a strongbox, heavy enough that she had to drag it rather than lift it, and beside the strongbox, wrapped in oiled canvas exactly as the coin and the piling had been, a second, smaller collection of documents that would prove, in time, far more significant than the coin itself. She hauled everything back to the cottage that morning, shaking with cold and with an excitement she hardly dared trust, and it was only once she had built up the fire and dried herself that she found the courage to break the strong box's rusted lock and look inside. What she found was a modest but genuine fortune in gold coin, several $100s worth by her careful count, more money than she had seen in her entire life, and beneath the coin, a ledger in her father's hand that began to explain, in his own careful words, exactly why such a sum had come to be hidden beneath a federal dock at all. The ledger, once Marguerite settled in to read it properly by lamplight over the following days, told a story her father had apparently carried silently for nearly 20 years. In the final months before the old Navy Yard's closure in 1882, Henrik Voss, then a young shipwright of perhaps 25, had been assigned to a small crew tasked with decommissioning equipment and settling the yard's final accounts before the federal government shuttered the station entirely. It was during this work that he discovered, quite by accident, that the yard's paymaster, a civilian contractor named Silas Talbot, who had managed procurement and payroll for the station's final several years, had been systematically defrauding the Navy through falsified supply invoices, billing the government for iron, canvas, and timber that was never actually delivered, and pocketing the difference through a network of false vendors he had established under invented names. Talbot, sensing the yard's closure approaching, and with it the end of easy opportunity, had apparently intended to abscond with a final, larger sum drawn against the yard's closing accounts, a theft substantial enough that Henrik's ledger estimated it at several $1,000s in the values of the day. But before Talbot could complete his final theft and disappear, as he had clearly planned, he died suddenly of a seizure of the heart, collapsing at his desk one evening, with the scheme only half executed, the stolen coin already withdrawn and hidden, but Talbot himself in no state to retrieve it or explain where it lay. Henrik, going through the paymaster's effects as part of the closing crew's ordinary duties, found among Talbot's papers a set of coded notes that, with the patience and careful attention that defined his character, he eventually puzzled out, leading him to the coin hidden in the very piling Marguerite had just uncovered. Rather than report the discovery, which he feared might implicate him in a scheme he had no part in and could not fully prove without risking his own reputation and livelihood, or simply take the money for himself, which his conscience would not permit, Henrik had made a decision that Marguerite, reading his words 2 decades later, found entirely in keeping with the father she remembered. He resealed the hiding place exactly as he found it, documented everything he had learned in careful detail, and left the fortune where it lay, intending, the ledger suggested, to someday find a way to return it properly to the town or the government it had been stolen from. A resolution he never managed to act on before the burdens of building his own shipyard, raising a daughter alone, and eventually his failing health overtook whatever plans he once held. He had left the note behind the floorboard, Marguerite understood now, not as an accident of memory, but as a quiet insurance against his own mortality, a message meant for whichever of his descendants might someday need it most, though surely he had never imagined the circumstances under which his own daughter would come to read it. The gold itself was a fortune beyond anything Marguerite had dared hope for in her reduced circumstances. But it was the second half of her father's ledger that would prove, in the weeks ahead, to matter even more. For tucked among Talbot's coded notes, and Henrik's careful decoding of them, was a detail that struck Marguerite with the force of genuine shock the first time she read it closely, enough to understand its full implication. Silas Talbot, the corrupt paymaster whose theft had inadvertently produced this hidden fortune, had not acted alone in his final scheme. His ledgers, as Henrik had painstakingly documented, showed regular, substantial payments made to a young clerk employed at the shipping firm that supplied much of the yard's materials. Payments disguised as consulting fees but clearly, in Henrik's careful annotation, functioning as kickbacks for falsified delivery receipts the clerk had signed off on to support Talbot's phantom invoices. The clerk's name, written plainly in Talbot's own hand and cross referenced by Henrik against the shipping firm's own surviving records, was Josiah Kettering, then a young man of perhaps 20 just beginning his career, decades before he would become Henrik Voss's shipyard partner, and eventually the man who stripped Henrik's own daughter of everything her father had built. Marguerite sat with the ledger open on her lap for a long time after that discovery, the cold cottage around her forgotten entirely, turning over in her mind the terrible, elegant symmetry of it, that the very man who had swindled her out of her inheritance through cleverly worded loan papers had, as a young man, helped defraud the federal government through cleverly falsified invoices. That his pattern of quiet, technical theft, dressed up in legitimate paperwork, was not a late development in an otherwise honest life, but a habit formed in his very earliest years, one her own father had apparently known about, or at least strongly suspected, for the better part of 2 decades, and had perhaps tolerated in their later partnership out of a decent man's reluctance to ruin another man's life over youthful sins never fully proven. Whatever mercy her father had extended to young Josiah Kettering all those years ago, Marguerite felt no particular obligation to extend the same mercy now, not after watching that same pattern of quiet theft destroy her father's health and claim everything he had spent his life building. She understood, reading those pages by lamplight in the cottage her $10 had bought her, that she was holding in her hands not merely an unexpected fortune, but the means, at last, to see some measure of justice done. Marguerite's first instinct was caution rather than confrontation, for she understood well enough that a 19-year-old woman living alone in a condemned Navy yard, however honestly she had come by her discovery, would find it easy for a man of Kettering's standing to dismiss, discredit, or simply outmaneuver if she moved carelessly. She spent several weeks quietly gathering what corroboration she could, traveling once by coach to the county seat to examine surviving federal procurement records from the old Navy Yard's final years, records that, remarkably, still existed in a dusty archive, and confirmed enough of Talbot's vendor names and dates to support her father's private ledger with something closer to official documentation. She also, cautiously, made contact with a retired naval procurement officer named Commodore Aldous Fenwick, a stern but fair man living in quiet retirement outside Portland, who had, it turned out, overseen the original investigation into irregularities at the Cardwell Yard's closing accounts. An investigation that had been abandoned decades earlier for lack of a living suspect once Talbot's death removed the case's obvious target, never realizing a second, younger conspirator had escaped notice entirely. Fenwick, presented with Henrik Voss's careful decoding of Talbot's records, was startled and then, gradually, convinced, recognizing in the old ledger's precise cross, referencing the same rigor he had once demanded of his own investigators. It was around this same time that word reached Kettering, as word inevitably does in a town the size of Cardwell Harbor, that the Voss girl had been asking unusual questions at the county archive and corresponding with a retired naval officer, and Kettering, sensing some vague threat he could not yet fully identify, began applying pressure of his own. First through a lawyer's letter questioning the legality of Marguerite's purchase of federal land at a municipal auction. Then through quieter, uglier means, spreading word around the harbor that the Voss girl had gone strange in her grief, squatting alone among rotten pilings, unfit company for decent families, an echo of the very tactics that had once helped ease his takeover of her father's yard. When legal challenge and rumor failed to move her, Kettering's men made one final, more direct attempt, arriving at the yard under cover of darkness, with the stated purpose of inspecting the condemned property for public safety. An excuse Marguerite recognized immediately as a pretext to search the grounds for whatever she had found. And it was only her own quick thinking. Having already moved the strongbox and her father's papers to a locked chest in the harbormaster's cottage, rather than leaving them anywhere near the dock, that kept her evidence and her fortune from being seized or destroyed before she was ready to bring it forward. Marguerite chose, in the end, to bring her evidence not to Cardwell Harbor's town council, which she suspected owed Kettering too many quiet favors to act against him decisively, but directly to Commodore Fenwick, who agreed, given the federal nature of the original theft, to formally reopen the matter through Navy channels, and to personally accompany Marguerite to a public hearing convened at the county courthouse the following spring, ostensibly to settle the question of her contested land title, but which both of them understood would become something considerably larger. The courthouse was crowded that morning, word having spread that the Voss girl intended some manner of dramatic revelation, and Kettering himself arrived with his lawyer, composed and faintly condescending, prepared. It was clear, to have the girl's claim to the Navy Yard dismissed as a technical irregularity in the municipal sale, and be done with the matter entirely. He was not prepared for Commodore Fenwick, in full and unmistakable naval bearing, to rise and present, on behalf of the reopened federal investigation, documentary evidence tracing a pattern of fraudulent payments from a deceased paymaster to a young shipping clerk named Josiah Kettering, evidence corroborated by surviving procurement records and by a private ledger kept, at considerable personal risk, by a shipwright named Henrik Voss, nearly 2 decades earlier. The color left Kettering's face as Fenwick spoke, and it did not return as the courthouse murmur swelled into open astonishment. Neighbor turning to neighbor to recall, now in a very different light, the convenient and well-timed manner in which this same Josiah Kettering had, 20 years later, maneuvered his way into sole ownership of the very shipyard built by the man who had once quietly protected his secret. The federal inquiry that followed moved slowly, as such things do, but moved decisively, for the evidence was too well documented to dismiss, and within the year Kettering found his reputation, his credit, and eventually his business interests unraveling under the weight of a scandal he had spent 2 decades believing safely buried, until he departed Cardwell Harbor entirely for parts unknown, a diminished and friendless man, leaving behind a shipyard now heavily encumbered by the very debts he had once used to strip it from its rightful owner. With Kettering gone and his fraudulent claim to the shipyard exposed as resting on the same pattern of deceit that had defined his earliest dealings, the yard's outstanding obligations reverted. Through a legal process, Commodore Fenwick himself helped Marguerite navigate to a receivership that she, as Henrik Voss's only heir, and the holder of considerable recovered capital, was uniquely positioned to settle. She did not use her father's hidden fortune to enrich herself alone, though the law would have allowed it. Instead, true to the very ledger that had guided her to this moment, she used the recovered gold to buy back her father's shipyard from receivership, restoring it under its original name, Voss Shipbuilding, and rehiring the craftsmen her father had once employed, men who had scattered to lesser positions up and down the coast when Kettering took control and let the yard's standards slip in pursuit of quicker profit. She used a further portion of the fortune, in consultation with Commodore Fenwick and the town council, to properly restore the old Navy Yard itself, rather than let it continue to rot, transforming its salvageable structures into a modest public dock and boat-building school, where young people of the town, regardless of means, could learn the same trade her father had once taught her, an institution she named, simply and without ceremony, the Voss Yard School, so that the value her father had quietly protected for 2 decades might go on protecting others long after her own lifetime. The gold that remained, after debts were settled and repairs completed, she returned in careful portion to the federal government through Commodore Fenwick's office, a gesture Fenwick himself argued against as unnecessary, but which Marguerite insisted upon, feeling it was the final, proper closing of an account her father had left open for 18 years, a debt of honesty that deserved to be paid in full rather than quietly forgotten now that it was convenient to forget it. And so we come back, as we always must, to where this story began, to a 19-year-old girl standing outside a locked boarding house door, with $10 folded into her shoe, buying a condemned ruin that every sensible person in Cardwell Harbor had long since written off as worthless. It would have been easy, that cold December morning, to see only what the townsfolk saw: rotten pilings, collapsed sheds, a girl throwing away her last coin on grief and stubbornness rather than sense. But Marguerite Voss carried with her something her father had spent her whole childhood teaching, mostly without words, simply by the patient, careful way he ran his hands over every plank before trusting it to hold a ship together. The understanding that a thing's true worth is very rarely visible from the surface, that what looks abandoned may simply be waiting, quietly and patiently, for someone willing to look beneath it. She did not set out to expose Josiah Kettering, and she did not set out to become wealthy. She set out only to survive one more cold winter, with the only resource left to her, and in doing so, uncovered not merely her father's hidden fortune, but the truth of an old injustice that had shaped the whole of her life without her ever knowing it. What she built afterward, from that unlikely beginning, outlasted the gold itself, and became, in time, the truest measure of what her father had always tried to teach her. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Marguerite Voss's story. If the idea of finding real worth in a place everyone else had abandoned means something to you, we would be grateful if you shared this video with someone who could use that reminder today. We will leave you, as we often do, with a question worth carrying with you. What is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Let us know in the comments. We truly do read every one. And if you would like to keep discovering stories like Marguerite's, we would love to have you follow or subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next journey we take together. Until next time, stay close.